We are going to begin the funeral service for Mrs. Mary P. Hines. I'd like to welcome our remote family and friends, and to the family that are here, make sure that your cell phones are off or in silent mode. Services will be conducted by Rabbi Samuel Gordon of Congregation Sukkot Shalom in Wilmette.
Mom was an amazing person. She was devoted to family, generous, witty, and intelligent. I hope to capture a few of the many facets that made up Mary P. Hines. Mom had a remarkably supple mind, illustrated by her unique proclivity to shape and change the English language, always informed by her underlying sense of humor. Nummy-nums or nummies were food. Din-din was dinner. Billy William was me. Masses Pack was her mother. Mrs. Annuals was my sister. Other examples were ooze over, meaning to come over as to someone's house. Tulips, Thanksgiving, holiday just passed. Blue, for the color blue. Private, for the preferred mode of airplane travel. And smallenize. She could also give several meanings or extend the syllables of common words, such as hellio, or well. Whatting else, as in which else had reverberations. She was earthy, as we all knew, and you'll pardon me for my earthiness here. Her term for lettuce was leotits. For apple pie was apple-a-pile. And one of her favorite expressions was, why are there so many horses, asses, than there are horses? She had a unique way to sign off from emails, incorporating some of the email's content into the final phrase. Birdingly, medically, gruesomely, flyingly, disturbingly, as well as the more usual hugs, lovingly and warmly. Her voracious intelligence was illustrated by her participation in the Western Civilization Book Group, of which she was a loyal member for many years. She would devour the books on the reading list so that when I called her on Sunday, she was reluctant to talk for too long lest she neglect her assigned reading. And typical of Mom, the content, plot, or learning points from her readings would inform her conversations for weeks and months afterward. It was sometimes hard to keep up with her mind. When email was just becoming popular, she was one of the first in the family to have an email address, still till the end, mphines@aol.com, and berated me that I did not check my emails from her frequently enough and did not respond to her emails with sufficient speed. I was always reminded of her superior medical knowledge. When going through medical school, learning physiology and anatomy, I would come home to be confronted with a basic medical question regarding colds, GI disturbances, or lung problems, for which Mom would know the answer while I did not. It took until residency for me to catch up, barely, with her vast fund of medical knowledge. Birding was an ideal way for her to bring together her love of nature, beauty, and detailed knowledge. She could spot birds when the rest of us could only see trees, bushes, and blue sky. She could recite detailed facts about a bird's migratory path, its mating rituals, how close to extinction it was or was not. This, of course, led the house to be populated with bird objects, bird pictures, bird clocks with bird noises, and let her have an extensive collection of bird socks. All of the above related to her many-year commitment to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and her stint on their board. With her facile mind and determination, she was quite an independent person. She spent time as a teenager out west enhancing her skills with horses and learning how to be a cowboy. She did this with only moderate and begrudging approval from her parents. When she attended Vassar, she was a spirited undergraduate with a devoted group of friends and a penchant for pushing up against the rules. When she married Dad, some of this independence was purposely suppressed as she happily undertook the role of mother and wife. Her job was to support and guide her children and to facilitate Dad's career in the business world. She gave up horseback riding because Dad had a phobia of horses. She had a notable but limited involvement with philanthropic activities such as the Scholarship and Guidance Association. She traveled, but only with Boo Boo. She socialized extensively, but predominantly with him. To emphasize, her love and devotion to the family was cheerful and completely enthusiastic. When my father died in 1984, it was as if the blankets covering her intelligence, independence, and determination were removed. She enlarged and deepened friendships with her extensive and diverse network. She had a packed social agenda. She traveled extensively and with a sense of adventure. She surrounded herself with culture and music, purchasing extra tickets in order to attend events with family and friends. She developed substantial commitments to many organizations, including the Board of Vassar, the Board of North Shore Country Day School, the Board of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, as I noted, and the Women's Board of the University of Chicago. In short, she blossomed in a way that was both remarkable and admirable, yet not really surprising. She was always a fully formed person, but she became more so as the years progressed. Finally, I cannot think of Mom without recalling her amazing generosity. She gave to close family, extended family, friends, causes, institutions large and small, and did so with singular enthusiasm and without any desire to be recognized for what she had done. Did anyone know that Mom and Tom donated plantings along Michigan Avenue? I did not until 2 weeks ago. For her, making lives and society better through giving was its own reward. These are the memories that will remain with us and that we celebrate today. Yet, none of us can escape biology, and her decline over the past several years was especially painful as she was robbed of all those attributes which made her so remarkable. The sparks of humor, wit, incisive insights diminished to the point that there were few and then none of these wonderful episodes. I will close by thanking those who enhanced her comfort and made her transition out of life as joyful and humane as it could be. My sister Ann moved to Chicago to care for Mom, and for that the family is eternally grateful. Leola cared for Mom for the last 7 years and was her trusted companion and gave her constancy and comfort as she lived through enormous changes in her life. Mabel was present for my mother's most recently and delivered kind and gentle care. My brother David was with her for the last weeks of her life, which was a source of comfort for Mom and for the family. My thanks and appreciation go to those whose presence enhanced the comfort of another human being, this being the greatest gift one person can give to another. Celebrating Mom makes saying goodbye easier. Thank you. Next, Anne will convey her sentiments.
I am grateful that we are able to gather to celebrate my mom, Granny to her children and grandchildren, and her many extraordinary qualities, and to grieve the profound loss of her indomitable spirit. Watching dementia diminish her, I've been grieving Granny's loss for a while. Today, with some perspective, I see that behind the veil of cognitive loss, her essence was actually visible, that she retained many of the elements that made her so uniquely herself. Granny retained some of her focus, even as the disease progressed. When Granny was still cooking, she loved to make Knorr's hollandaise sauce to accompany her vegetables. A powdered mix that required the additions of milk, butter, and heat, Granny attacked the project with an amazing attention to detail and characteristic concentration. Watching her provided a window onto how she approached all her work. Granny remained flawlessly gracious. When I accompanied her to the hair salon to get her feathers ruffled, Granny's verbiage, undoubtedly an old friend or acquaintance would come up to her and chat. Granny would smile, greeting the person warmly, perhaps taking her hand. As we walked away, Granny would turn to me and ask, in not the quietest voice, "Who the hell was that?" Quintessential Granny. She always got straight to the point. Granny remained a warm host. When I entered her living room, Granny would ask Leola, her devoted longtime caregiver, if we had met before, then proceeded to introduce me as an old friend. It was important to Granny that her visitors were comfortable. With introductions complete, we'd converse. Granny would work hard to track the conversation, injecting the appropriate phrases to continue the discussion, as well as the occasional perfectly timed expletive that made us laugh uproariously. Granny maintained her beautiful smile and hearty laugh. When you asked Granny if she were hungry, she would often reply with her own question, "Are you?" Similarly, if you asked, "Are you warm enough?" she'd be more concerned with the questioner's comfort. If your hands were cold, she would hold them tightly in hers to warm them and act elementally motherly and generous. She still appreciated books. Reading aloud to her from a collection of children's poetry, Granny would laugh out loud at a good rhyme, turn of phrase, or relatable image. She developed a tender heart and would cry at the description of violence or depiction of meanness. This all made watching movies very difficult. But I found strength in her ability to cry. Granny continued to love nature and appreciate beauty. In spring, the redbud trees on her street filled her with wonder. In the summer, she enjoyed surveying her verdant backyard. As any self-respecting Jewish mother does, Granny remained a worrier. Gone were the days when a slight hitch in her voice or annoyingly wise question telegraphed her concern. Her worry became visible in her deeply furrowed brow. She expressed concern for family members, especially for her brother Tom, and left unspoken the concern she felt on and off for herself. Granny remained a classy lady. She was always dressed in a crisp cotton shirt, matching cardigan, Lululemon pants, and a fabulous pair of novelty socks. Her hair, of course, was beautifully coiffed, and on special occasions, her lips highlighted by a deep red lipstick. I need to pause here to express the eternal appreciation we, Bill, David, and I, have for Granny's caregivers, Leola and Mabel, who made sure that Granny looked and felt her best. They made it possible for Granny to age in place and to do so with dignity. To the last day of her life, Granny remained tenacious. Granny died early Wednesday morning, many hours after the hospice nurse told us her passing was imminent. I have no doubt that she heard the nurse's prediction and thought, to hell with her, I'm doing this at my own pace. In life, Granny was incredibly generous, and in death, she gave us one last gift. It was early morning and still dark when David and I followed Granny's gurney out the front door of her house. As we stood on her stoop watching her being lifted into the hearse, there was a flurry of activity, a grannyism. In the yew bush to our right, a beautiful male cardinal appeared. For Granny, a bird watcher and lover of cardinals, this sighting seemed more than a lucky accident. With a little research, we discovered that the word cardinal comes from the word cardinalis and the Latin word cardo, meaning hinge. In symbology, quote, the cardinal serves as the hinge on the doorway between earth and spirit, delivering messages back and forth. While Granny's passing leaves a large hole in our hearts and our lives, I hope that any cardinal you see, whether real or depicted, will bring you some comfort and a brief closeness to this amazing person we shared. My brother David will speak next.
There's no doubt that Mary Hines is a true original, singular in her acumen, unique in her humor, panoramic in her curiosities. But what makes her story so compelling is her evolution as a person. While it's never easy and perhaps not advisable to condense a complex human being such as my mom down to her essences, I would argue that Mary experienced 3 distinct phases during my life. We might call these Mary versions 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And just like our increasingly digital world, these versions each represented incremental improvements, one to the next. Mary version 1.0 was the dutiful and devoted wife to Harold and quirky mother to us. In retrospect, there's very little doubt she played a large role in our dad's success, probably more so than many of us ever realized. During these years, Mom honed basic elements of her uniqueness. It might come as a shock, but I never really knew that Mary had a distinctive voice. She was my mother, and I didn't know how other mothers might have talked. I had no idea that other moms didn't turn the word well into 3 syllables, as Cousin Lawrence quipped. The elongated pronunciations, mellifluous articulation, and idiosyncratic expressions that Bill spoke about were constant. Slowly, however, my friends and their families provided circumstantial clues. Mom and Dad's mutual endearment turned the tide of my ignorance. They called each other boo-boo. My mother's spelled B-U-B-U, and my father's spelled B-O-O-B-O-O. A seminal psychoanalytical moment came when I had a friend over as a young boy, and Mary would bellow for Harold in a different part of the house, "Oh, bew-bew." Best of all, she had very little, if any, self-consciousness about such matters. She was always unabashedly and proudly herself. The tectonic shock of my father's unexpected death in 1984 shook Mary's world to its absolute core. Gone was the gravitational pull of her husband's presence. Here the transition to Mary 2.0 began, and her situation provoked growth in amazing ways. True, Mom was always independently spirited, but this kind of solo voyage was absolutely new. She plunged headlong into her varied interests, deepening her commitments. Thematically and practically, her philanthropic endeavors transitioned from women's boards to boards of trustees. She forged an ever more dynamic path. Her dear friends Susan Stone and Mary used to go casually birding around the Skokie lagoons, until, as Mrs. Stone joked, Mary got her PhD in bird watching and got more serious. Not a literal graduate degree, of course, but a self-driven study of ornithology that eventually led her to the board at Cornell. Make no mistake, those wacky outgoing messages in her voicemail were carefully considered. Mary 2.0 earned a real sense of gravitas that she brought to her wide circle of friends and organizations. As an advisor, a strategist, and a fierce fundraiser, she was formidable. As a beloved young development officer tells, when Mary finally put down her editorial red pen after toiling on her fundraising letter, the officer felt like saying with a salute, "Thank you, Mrs. Hines, sir." Approval from my mother really meant something. Perhaps not surprisingly, my mother and I experienced occasional conflict, differences of opinion that resulted in healthy debates. Mary was not a shrinking violet. She held her convictions vigorously. I remember taking a walk with her and her dog down her leafy Winnetka Street one summer day many years ago. A neighbor had moved in weeks before and had left a pile of discarded boxes curbside in front of their new house. On a previous dog walk by herself, Mary and her pooch discovered that this pile of apparent cardboard also contained live garbage. She was outraged, convinced that rotting food amid the pile was certainly an indication that something was seriously amiss with these new neighbors. I defended these unseen folks and considered a few festering carrots scant evidence of any malice. Within 3 months, however, this neighbor was arrested after leading police on a high-speed chase on Eaton's Expressway and charged with running a multi-state Ponzi scheme. Mary always had impeccable instincts, and I learned it was often, if not always, wise to agree. I find real solace in Mary 2.0's rich life. She traveled, she read widely. Her philanthropic efforts, as well as her daily interactions with friends, family, and associates alike, had a tangibly positive effect had tangibly positive effects on the world. She left a wake of goodwill wherever she went, and she did so with utter selflessness. Hers is a life worthy of admiration. When Mom's mind started to slow down a bit 5 years ago, I must admit to feeling deeply frustrated at times. I'd spent my entire life trying to keep up with my mother's quick wit. It was an unnerving experience. It was unnerving to have those roles reversed. What emerged in Mary 3.0 might not have been the intellectual heights and wonderfully discursive discussions we had become used to. Indeed, it was the emotional aspects of Mary that this last chapter unleashed. We'd always known she had a soft side during versions 1.0 and 2.0, but in her distinctively Pickian way, her soft edges were at times a tad blurry. Mary 3.0 was quick to a tear, liked to hold hands, felt things deeply and immediately. Gone might have been the banter, the quick references, the rollicking silliness, but in their stead, my mother's essential goodness and sweetness finally had unfettered expression. Despite the somber finality of this occasion, let's celebrate and honor the wonderful life Mary P. Hines led. May we all take inspiration from her many facets. I promise to give it the old Vassar try. Next up will be Sue Pick.
I'm Sue Pick, Mary's lucky sister-in-law, and I'm not here to talk about Mary's accomplishments, although they are many and have been wonderfully recited by her children. I'd just like to say a few words about my personal relationship with her. 60 years ago, at our rehearsal dinner, someone, and it may have been John Hines, predicted that I was going to have 2 mothers-in-law. Boy, were they wrong. They couldn't have been more wrong about one of them. Mary, of course. When we returned from our honeymoon, Mary brought over a big bag of rags to our new apartment. Who else would think of that? It turned out to be the most useful gift of all, even though it didn't inspire me to clean. When 3 of our 4 kids were in the hospital at once, and our cleaning lady left, Mary came over and vacuumed our very neglected Glencoe house, which it sorely needed. When our children were little, Mary and I spent countless hours chatting on the phone. This was in the days before cordless phones, so we were not able to move around and get anything done that wasn't within reach of the longest phone cord. I would say, Mary, I've got to get off the phone now and start dinner. Or, Mary, I've got to let you go because the kids are killing each other. But of course, she always had something else to discuss, and it was never dull. I couldn't get over the depth of her encyclopedic knowledge and her amazing memory. I admired Mary's bravery, which was never more apparent than when she got the news that Harold had been taken to Northwestern Memorial with a sudden heart attack. She called and asked if I could come over. I quickly found a friend to take 6-year-old Charlie, and then I rushed over to 1350. When the hospital finally called with the tragic news, she was incredible. She insisted on calling her children and her parents herself. She handled all of the coming weeks with amazing strength and dignity. In the late 90s, when we had lost several close family members all in a row, we started thinking about our own mortality. Tom and I actually bought plots across from the rest of the family. I used to kid Mary because she wanted to be cremated, and I didn't, since I'm always too hot anyway. I would ask her, how will we be able to talk on the phone if you're cremated and I'm not? It became a running joke between us. I guess we will soon find out. Mary, you and I were sisters from another mother. I will miss your voice in my ear, but it will always be in my heart. The next is Sally Hines.
I first met Mary the week Bill and I graduated from Amherst College, when we and our respective roommates hosted a reception in our suites for our parents the day before the ceremony. I have only a hazy memory of her from that day, which is odd because Mary was so very memorable. And I mean this in the most complimentary way. I do remember that she was poised and charming. Little did I think that day I would marry her son and become part of the family. When Bill invited me to Winnetka for the end of year holidays in 1980, I began to get to know Mary. I remember coming into the kitchen after arrival at Hackberry Lane and seeing her dressed in a kilt, a Peter Pan collared blouse, a cashmere cardigan, knee socks, and loafers. This is an interesting person, I thought, possibly eccentric and certainly worth getting to know. Indeed, that outfit, classic in its way, practical and unfussy, could describe Mary as well. Mary was authentic, a word that has been rather overused, but in its meaning of being able to express one's genuine self because one understands one's genuine self, it fit Mary perfectly. She was born to a family of great affluence and lived her entire life with material largesse, but she was neither entitled nor insecure. She had perfect equipoise. She understood the good using her resources could do for her children and their children, and for the arts and educational institutions she loved in Chicago and beyond, and gave generously of her funds, her insight, and her wisdom over her lifetime. Because she was authentic, she was also secure and never needed to make a point about what she had or what she could do. I'll never forget the time when the kids were little and we had a wonderful Danish au pair, Meta, who came with us to Granny Mary's for Christmas. Meta was studying the Matisse painting, Christmas Oysters, that hangs over the room. She finished looking at it and turned to Mary and said, "That is the best Matisse reproduction I have ever seen." Without missing a beat, Mary smiled and simply said, "Thank you." Many years ago, I read a humorous bit that said while most people worried about hardening of the arteries as they aged, what they really needed to worry about was hardening of the categories. This was never an issue for Mary. She had a supple intelligence coupled with a natural curiosity that never ended. I think we initially over things kind. We were both dog nerds. As we got to know each other better, our talks ranged across literature, politics, animals, the natural world, horticulture, photography, theater, in fact, the entire human condition. We spoke often by phone. Bill used to say that his mother really called to say hi to him and then settle in for an hour or more with me. I can still hear in my head her question, "What else?" spoken with a deliberately comical German inflection as we would near the end of a wide-ranging and lengthy phone chat. She adored our three children, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Sam, and took a lively interest in their accomplishments and doings, from the time they were infants through to their choice of professional careers. As the kids were growing up, we got to see her a fair amount during her terms on the Vassar College Board, as she would stay with us before or after the quarterly trustee meetings. She always came with gift books exquisitely keyed to our kids' existing interests, as well as to interests they did not yet know they would have. Mary used to say, "Old age isn't for sissies." She plowed into her 70s and early 80s with the same joie de vivre she had manifested her entire life. She faced her final illness and decline with courage and stoicism. Even when she could not express herself as she had been accustomed to doing her entire life, a squeeze from her hand and the look in her eyes communicated the love she felt. Mary, we'll remember you in so many ways. Your amusing voices and neologisms, your institutional inventory of talenti gelato, your string of eccentrically lovable standard poodles, your chirping bird clock, and literally loony answering machine. But most of all, for your legacies of love, service, generosity, and loyalty to your family, friends, and institutions to whom you gave so generously of your time, resources, and talent. And now my daughter Elizabeth, Mary's oldest grandchild, will speak.
One of my earliest memories of my grandmother takes place at Lakeshore Country Club on the 4th of July. It was a really hot day, and the huge sloping lawn in front of the lake was packed with people. She held my hand as we walked toward one of the long tables full of food, and then she stopped, suddenly, and looked down at me. And she fixed me with that look that meant, I mean business. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that look, you know the one I mean. She said, now listen, Miss Lizzie, there are a lot of aggressive Jews and not enough food. You gotta use your elbows. And then she put her fists on her hips and she stuck her elbows out and wiggled them just enough to demonstrate the correct combative food fetching stance. That was my grandmother, a woman who loved her family and her nummy-nums and who was willing to wield elbows in defense of both. A woman who was a self-possessed, badass lady who knew that the world wouldn't become the place you wanted it to be just by wishing. She wouldn't have minded me calling her a badass either. She'd have asked me what it meant, and then she would have nodded approvingly. In that moment, and in so many others, Granny Mary showed me what it looked like to know what you want and to ask for it. And then she showed me if you didn't get it, do it your damn self. Every time she'd come to our house in Connecticut, which luckily was quite often, within 15 minutes of her arrival, I'd hear my name being called out in my grandmother's sing-song voice, beckoning, Miss Lizzie, and I'd go trotting down to the guest room where she stayed, and she'd already be in the process of removing the quilt from the bed. She didn't have to tell me what to do. As the oldest grandchild, I just knew, because every time she came to visit, we remade the bed the way she wanted it done. Quilt folded at the bottom of the bed, top sheet tucked in with hospital corners. My grandmother was a model of someone who knew what she was passionate about and was generous with her time and resources in support of those things. Often when Granny came to visit, it was part of a trip to Vassar. And as a kid, I never really knew what brought her there, just that whatever she was doing, she cared a lot about, and it seemed to impact a lot of people in a positive way. In that way, and maybe unknowingly, Granny Mary instilled in me the importance of doing things you are passionate about and that do some good in the world. Given the career paths that me and my siblings chose, I think it's safe to say that's a lesson that resounded with all three of us. My grandmother was optimistic that the world could be a better place, but under absolutely no illusions, it would get there on its own. And she was not complacent about pouring her time, energy, and resources into institutions that benefited the things she valued dearly. Institutions that supported education, the arts, science and medicine, among other things. But her support of good works was not the only way my grandmother exhibited her love for culture and life of the mind. She was a voracious reader of books, watcher of movies, and listener of live music. She imbued an appreciation for learning, books, and intellectual curiosity in her grandchildren. She would send emails to share an article or a link or a picture she found that she thought was interesting. She gifted us with books and Ken Burns documentaries. As kids, she'd bring illustrated books with lush images that she would read to us. And later in life, it was impossible to have a conversation with Granny about a book without her sending it to you in the mail a few days later. She watched whatever we were watching on TV with us and always, always asked about the cultural references or jokes she didn't understand. She was a woman who never, ever was done learning. Granny Mary was an inquisitive, opinionated, outspoken lady in a time when those attributes weren't always celebrated among women. And as someone who considers herself to share a lot of those attributes on my good days, I can say they still aren't often celebrated among the female persuasion. And so I was particularly lucky to have in my life an example of a woman who was so fully herself, who devoted herself so completely to her passions, who was so relentlessly curious, who was so meticulous with her thoughts and always vocal about her conclusions, and who took a lot of joy in dressing sharply and sporting a bold lip color while doing it. Whenever we were traveling, my grandmother would always say, "You should always stop and use the bathroom when one is available because, as King George would say, you never know when you have to stop and watch a parade." I have no idea if any part of that is something that King George said, but I do know that every time I duck into a bathroom out in the world, I think of my grandmother saying that. It's a deeply Mary Hines aphorism, full of practical wisdom and subtle wit, just like her advice on that sticky July day about liberal elbow use to assure adequate food procurement among pushy Jews. Both are life lessons that have served me immensely well. At the end of every phone conversation with my grandmother, after she'd explored every topic exhaustively, she'd release you from the conversation by saying, "Well, I must press on." Granny Mary lived her life very much like one long, terribly interesting conversation. And she has pressed on. But I like to think that in the Jewish way, her conversation will be carried on by the many, many people whose lives she's touched. The next and last speaker will be my younger brother, Sam Hines.
Hello, everyone. Mary Hines was a true treasure. She was a woman who excelled in all areas of life, from intelligence to poise and from fashion to eloquence. Her resume, listing her philanthropic and cultural contributions, could go on for pages. She was a proud and accomplished woman who never settled for anything less than greatness. Most of all, Mary was my loving grandmother. To me, she was Granny Mary. As many of you know, Granny Mary was a well-seasoned consumer of all things food-related. In keeping with the Hines and Pick genes, my grandmother planned her day around her meals. Thanksgiving dinner couldn't be complete without discussing a detailed itinerary for lunch during Black Friday shopping. A Sunday brunch buffet was not to be approached without a succinct and thorough plan of attack. You had to maneuver through the crowds to get to the good stuff and use your elbows, and always ensure you had extra room, or how she eloquently always put it, more nummies. Dessert was legally required, trust me, I'm almost a lawyer, and should always be centered around ice cream. My grandmother's freezer was a well-stocked treasure trove of frozen delights, which would regularly get raided when the Hines children came to Chicago. As mentioned earlier, my grandmother had a keen eye for fashion. In fact, the very tie I am wearing right now was hand-selected by her after her rigorous analysis at the Hermes tie rack. Her collection of brightly colored scarves with intricate patterns, pictures, and symbols was truly mesmerizing to look at. Her sock collection could give the MoMA and the Art Institute of Chicago a run for their money. She had drawers on drawers of Picasso, Van Gogh, and Pollock themed socks. Most years, Granny Mary would come to Connecticut for Thanksgiving, and the members of the Hines family would make a pilgrimage to Mitchell's, which is a high fashion department store. Upon arrival, my grandmother would closely examine and meticulously analyze every item in the store to give her precise and detailed recommendations as to what my father and I should potentially take home. If you knew my grandmother well, you know that she was not one for keeping her opinions a mystery. She was unafraid to give her full and honest take on each article of clothing that was considered during the Mitchell's run. My father once selected a blazer which did not appeal to my grandmother's eye, and I don't think my dad's ego will ever be the same. My grandmother was also an intellect of the highest order. She was sharp as a tack and always engaged in rigorous debate at the dinner table. She was well-versed in birds, literature, the latest political corruption scandal in the Chicago mayor's office, the local gossip in Winnetka, the scholarly studies being done at Vassar and Yale, and the latest Hockney exhibit at the Met. The list goes on and on. Her curiosity and phenomenal sense of humor turned any mundane subject into an entertaining and interesting topic. She was a magician with words and never ceased to amaze me how she lit up a room with her unique turns of phrase. One of the most important gifts my grandmother has given me and will continue to give me is instilling the importance of education. My grandmother was always a proponent of following your interests and to use education as a vehicle to achieve those goals. Her generosity to my sisters, my cousins, and my own education will never be overlooked or taken for granted. Granny Mary has given me the tools and ability to further my own interests in the humanities and pursue my own dream of becoming a lawyer. She has made it possible for several Hines and Pick children and grandchildren to achieve their highest potential. I am truly grateful for that gift. My grandmother was an amazing woman. Her Jewish-infused humor and ability to connect with anyone who crossed her path is something I will cherish for the rest of my life. I will always be in awe of her presence, grace, and intellectual power that she exhibited on a day-to-day basis. She will continue to live on in my heart and mind through the wonderful memories that I got to experience with her. I am truly grateful for the time I was able to interact, laugh, engage, and debate with her while she could still fight off eager Sunday brunch goers as the Four Seasons. She's a role model for me and will continue to be forever. I love you, Granny, and always will. And now back to Rabbi Sam Gordon.
I understand that the whole time of the introduction and the readings before were not heard. And it's very clear to me that in many ways, nothing was needed from me. What was said by all of you was so fitting and such a tribute to her. Understanding that in this moment of loss, there was a celebration of a remarkable, extraordinary life, one that was and will be unforgettable. She died right at Thanksgiving, that time when we gather as families together around our table. Though this year was far more challenging and we were connected perhaps only by the internet and by Zoom, just as we are on this day, in years to come and in generations to come, while there may be an empty chair at the table, her spiritual presence will always be felt. Her story will be retold. What was so extraordinary about her will not be forgotten. She herself was not, by definition, religious, but she turned to Psalms and poetry. Psalm 23 continues to speak to us. If you wish to say it with me, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. As on this beautiful day, entering into winter, this first week of December, we know that the cycle of seasons moves, as we are right now, into the time of cold and darkness, but is followed by spring with the new buds and summer with its warmth. So too in the cycles of our life, we experience loss, death, sadness. But that is followed by the warmth of memory, the stories that continue to be told. Words of Ecclesiastes teach us, for everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot that which is planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Oh God, you give us loved ones and make them the strength of our life, the light of our eyes. They depart and leave us bereft on a lonely way, but you are the living fountain from which our healing flows. To you, the stricken look for comfort and the sorrow laden for consolation. Oh God, we see life as through windows that open on eternity. We see that love endures and the soul endures as you, O God, endure forever. We see that the years are more than grass that withers, more than flowers that fade. They weave a timeless pattern in a world that is the dwelling place of your love and glory. The memorial prayer, El Malei Rachamim, El Malei Rachamim Shochem Bamramim, Hamitzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, Im Kedoshim Utohorim Kazohar HaRakia, Mazirim Et Nishmat Miriam, Shahalcha La'olama, Baal HaRachamim, Yistareha B'Seter Kanafav La'olamim, Bitror Bitror HaChayim Et Nishmata, Adonai Hu Nachlata V'Tanuach B'Shalom Al Mishkava, V'Nomar Amen. O eternal God, compassionate one, Spirit of the universe, we ask that you grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Mary P Hines, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let her find refuge in your eternal presence, within the shadow of your wings. Let her soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is her inheritance, may she rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.
The family will be having a virtual Shiva starting tonight from 7 until 9, and then Saturday from 4 until 6, both Central Time for anybody who's watching who's not from Central Time. That information is on our website as well. We are going to end the chapel service with a few of her favorite songs, along with the photo montage. On behalf of the family, thank you.
All right, we're going to continue with the interment service. Sorry for the delay. We had to set up the Zoom, and we're going to continue the interment service. Yep. Bill, and join me up here for a moment. For those that are wearing a ribbon. And if you'll join me here for a moment. What we do here is the cutting of the career ribbon. So it's a symbol of a tear in the fabric of a family's life. We know that when cloth is torn, we can resew it and reweave it and it's usable again. But no matter how fine the tailor or how exact the needle, you always know that the tear was there. So immediacy of grief heals, and mourning becomes memory. But you always be aware that she's not there physically. But that is also a measure of enduring love. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam dayan ha'emet. Blessed art thou, Lord our God, judge of truth. Either I had no strength or that your day. There we go. Thank you. There we go. So let's gather around, if you will. If anyone wants to sit, fine. This is very simple and short here at the graveside. And certainly in terms of this family, which I've been fortunate enough through Sue and Betsy to know, there is something really quite remarkable to have a family gathering of generations of memory and story and history, and that in many ways Mary is drawn back into that family circle. The dust returns to the earth as it was, the spirit returns to God who gave it. It is only the house of the spirit which we now lay within the earth. The spirit itself cannot die. Receive in mercy, O God, the soul of our departed Mary P Hines. Grant her that everlasting peace which you have prepared for us in the world to come. Though no human eye has seen, nor ear has heard, nor mind has grasped it, still is our sure inheritance, our everlasting portion. O God, help us to understand that grief and love go hand in hand, that the pain which loss inflicts is the measure of a love stronger than death. Though we cry in the bereavement of our hearts, may we be like children who know that their parent is near, who cling unafraid to the trusted hand. In this spirit, O God, do we commit all that is precious to us and to your keeping. We repeat the words of the mourner's Kaddish, words hallowed for generations. Yikadal v'yikadash shemei rabbah, v'yalma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, v'gala u'v'izman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevorach le'olam almei almaya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'tadar v'yitalev v'yithalau shemei d'kudashah b'richu. Leila min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, dat miram bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shamayim, v'chayim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May the source of peace grant peace to all who mourn, comfort to all who are bereaved. Amen. And may this time, this challenging time that we are going through, soon come to an end in safety and in good health. May we look forward to this time of family gatherings and the new year with the blessings of memory as well as healing. And may you all continue to keep Mary's story, narrative, memory alive through the way in which you touch others. Zecher tzadikin livracha, may the memory of the righteous be an enduring blessing. Amen. You want to come forward, and this is earth from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So we place that on, and I'll just put it in your hand, okay? Let's put some, and just place it on top. Yeah, just put it. for those who wish to help in the covering of the grave, he's bringing some plastic gloves if you want to use those to help with 3 shovels of earth.
Yeah, being a sign of the times. We're living some more times. You could use your gloves if you're comfortable. If you want to wash your hands afterwards, it's whatever you want.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Just a last act of kind of covering the blanket.
I just feel like there's one more thing to say.
Do you want to say it on the mic so
No, it's
people?
all right. It's Bill's birthday today, and I feel like it just needs to be acknowledged, because as sad as we are, there is life goes on. We're happy to be here with you to celebrate your birthday.
Thank you. No, it is the circle of life. That's what it's all about.
Do you want to try to do the tulips?
Whatever you guys feel like.
Sure. Let's do it. Yeah.
What do you want to do?
You want to put can we put a tulip in there?
Sure, go ahead.
Tulips are right there. You want to do one at a time? You know, for tulips.
Glad you were able to get some.
Ironic will be for tulip tree. Yeah. Stuck in the landing. Yeah. What?